What was the Second Vatican Council, or what is commonly referred to as Vatican II? What did they discuss there and who was involved? And maybe most importantly, with so many people referencing changes to the Catholic Church that were made during the Second Vatican Council, what actually happened? What were the results of the council and what has changed since then? Well, let's find out. Hello, and welcome to Saints and Skeptics, a podcast where we discuss common questions about the Catholic faith, the history of the church, the lives of saints and church doctors. We're going to talk about theology, philosophy, and a whole lot more. My name is Michael Ryan. I'm so grateful that you've joined us today. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Second Vatican Council, or what is commonly referred to as Vatican II. We're going to talk about why the council was held in the first place, who was involved, what they discussed, what the outcomes were, really a lot of different things. We have a whole bunch of different questions, a lot of different things that people have brought up to me in my personal life, that I've read online, that I've heard over the years of being Catholic. We're going to go through all of those as well. This topic is a really big one, like a really, really big one. It's so big, in fact, that if I'm being totally honest with you, it took me multiple weeks of reading and research just to put this episode together. And that was after multiple weeks of putting it off, since I knew that it was such a big task. So for those of you who are listening who aren't Catholic, or maybe you're just not familiar with this topic, that might sound a little bit weird. Why is it such a big topic, right? But I'm going to do my best during this episode to explain why it is, why it's so important, why the council meant so much, and then what impacts it had on the faith as a whole. I also want to say up front that I'm going to try to do my absolute best to remain impartial during this episode and just present the facts as I have them. This topic, right, Vatican II, it can be super convoluted. People tend to have really strong opinions about it. So I'm going to do everything I can to kind of stay away from that side of things and focus more on what actually happened and how we got to where we are today. I mean, I have opinions just like everyone else, but that's not really the point of the episode. And in many ways, it's not really a point of this show in general. I want to go over the facts, right? The real truth of whatever the outcome of the council was. And I'm sure that down the road, I'll probably have a chance to share my personal opinions later. But for now, I just want to stick to what actually happened. So with that being said, let's just jump right in. So to begin, this event was called the Second Vatican Council. But what does that even mean? So a council in the Catholic Church, it's a term that's short for an ecumenical council. And this is a worldwide meeting of bishops, which is convened by the Pope. The point of convening them is to clarify or to define church teachings and talk about updates to practices, talk about things that are currently going on in the world, etc. The term ecumenical comes from a Greek term, Oecumenici, meaning the whole inhabited world. So in the Catholic context, an ecumenical council represents the universal church as opposed to a local or a regional council. And so if you were to have a grouping or a meeting with a local or regional council of the church, those are typically referred to as synods. So those are a little bit different. These ecumenical councils oftentimes happen in times of crisis, war, confusion, famine, etc. But that's not necessarily a requirement. It doesn't have to be crummy times to hold a council. You can have them basically whenever the Pope deems them necessary. There have been 21 ecumenical councils so far in the Catholic Church. The first one being the First Council of Nicaea, which happened around AD 325. And then the latest being Vatican II, this one, which ended in 1965, and that's the one we're going to be talking about today. So it is the most recent council that the Catholic Church has held. We've actually done an episode on an ecumenical council before. If I remember correctly, it was episode 4 of season 1, which was about the Council of Trent, and that was another hugely important council. You know, if there was like a hierarchy of all the councils and which ones were the most important, Vatican II and the Council of Trent would definitely be up there. So if you haven't checked that episode out yet, I would highly recommend adding that to your queue to go to after this one, because there's a lot of great information in there as well. So why have these councils? Why do they occur? What makes them important? What's the point? Well, they occur because as time moves forward, right? And as world events take place, there's always a need for discussions regarding matters of the faith, of morals, discipline, even church governance. All of those things are discussed during these councils. And oftentimes, the best way to have these discussions, especially about difficult topics, is to have the leaders of the church, the bishops, meet together and kind of just go over everything. These councils are important for a huge range of reasons, right? They've helped the church defend and clarify doctrine. So, for example, these councils what has clarified things like the Trinity, Christ's divinity, Christ's humanity, etc. The councils correct heresies, which is huge. They set liturgical norms. They respond to crises. They, guide the faithful. They really do. And so, according to canon law and church tradition, an ecumenical council must be convened by the Pope. Bishops from all across the world must be invited to it. It's not like he could convene a council and just say, only the bishops from Austria can come, right? Like, that's not the way it goes. And then the topics discussed during the council only become binding when they are ratified by the Pope himself, right? And so these councils can teach infallibly when defining doctrines of like faith and morals, but the very large majority of all the things that they're discussing, all the documents that they create, they only become binding after they're ratified by the Pope. All right, so now we know, at least somewhat, what an ecumenical council is and why they're held, why they're important, etc. So let's talk about the most recent one, which is Vatican II. So the Second Vatican Council, which again, everybody for whatever reason refers to it as Vatican II. I think the proper name is the Second Vatican Council, but it's always just called Vatican II. This was the 21st Ecumenical Council. It was held between 1962 and 1965. And as I mentioned, it was and is still one of the most significant events in modern church history. The council's aim, the goal, was not to define new dogmas or condemn heresies, which is what they were doing at many of the earlier councils, but rather for this one, they wanted to renew the church's life and mission in the modern world. Pope St. John the 23rd was the pope who called the council together in 1962. And rather than telling you why I think the council was convened or telling you what other people have said regarding why it was convened, let's just read it exactly from what Pope St. John the 23rd said himself as to why it was convened. This is what I'm trying to do throughout the whole episode here. I'm just going to try to read what they actually said. Like, what were their words? Why did they do it, right? So in his opening letter to the council, he states the following, quote, "The salient point of this council is not, therefore, a discussion of one or another article of the Church's fundamental doctrine, a diffuse repetition of the teaching of the Fathers and of ancient and modern theologians, which is presumed to be well known and familiar to all. For this, a council was not necessary. What instead is necessary today is that the whole of Christian doctrine, with no part of it lost, be received in our times by all with a new fervor, in serenity and peace, in that traditional and precise conceptuality and expression which is especially displayed in the acts of the councils of Trent and Vatican I. As all sincere promoters of Christian, Catholic, and apostolic faith strongly desire, what is needed is that this doctrine be more fully and more profoundly known, and that the minds be more fully imbued and formed by it. What is needed is that this certain and unchangeable doctrine, to which loyal submission is due, be investigated and presented in the way demanded by our times. For the deposit of faith, the truths contained in our venerable doctrine are one thing. The fashion in which they are expressed, but with the same meaning and the same judgment, is another thing. This way of speaking will require a great deal of work, and it may much patience. Types of presentation must be introduced which are more in accord with a teaching authority which is primarily pastoral in character." End quote. Okay, big quote there. All right, that was a big, let's pull some stuff out of that. He says a lot of really cool things there. So first, Pope John says that the point of the council is not to discuss doctrine or make any changes or additions to it. He states that this has already been done in the past to great success. He mentions that this doctrine should be well known at this point, and it should be familiar to his audience, who were a large group of bishops of the church, right? So his point is, we've talked about doctrine a lot. We've talked about theology a lot, and all of you should know about all of that. So we don't need to have another council about that. So what he's trying to say is, he's not calling the council to discuss a change in doctrine, So then why did he call it? Well, he tells us that, right? He says, quote, "What instead is necessary today is that the whole of Christian doctrine, with no part of it lost, be received in our times by all with a new fervor. What is needed is that this doctrine be more fully and more profoundly known, and that the minds be more fully imbued and formed by it. What is needed is that this certain and unchangeable doctrine, to which loyal submission is due, be investigated and presented in the way demanded by our times." End quote. So he's saying that the doctrine doesn't need to be changed, but that the presentation of said doctrine does need to be changed, most likely, in order to be presented in a more modern way, which will in turn allow it to be received with a new fervor, right? More people receiving the word of Christ because it's being presented in a different way. So let's just summarize this, right? Pope John the 23rd described this goal as, in Italian, I believe, it's an aggiornamento, which is an updating or a bringing up to date of the church's practices and presentation. So it's not to bring up to date the church's truths, right? Those are already up to date. It's to talk about the practices and presentation of the church. So that was the purpose of the council. Was this purpose accomplished? Well, let's just keep going. I'll let you make that decision for yourself. So now we know why the council was convened, but when did it all happen? Well, as we mentioned earlier, the beginning was in 1962, but it actually took place over 4 different sessions. It's not like they showed up to the Vatican and it was just one session for days, weeks, months, whatever, and then it was just done. It actually happened over the course of 4 individual sessions. And those happened between 1962 and 65. And the outcome of these sessions, and then the council as a whole, was 16 official documents. And these 16 documents are most often divided into 4 constitutions, 9 decrees, and 3 declarations. So let's talk about each of these 4 sessions in more detail, because by talking about the 4 sessions, it'll bring us closer to understanding these 16 documents. So the first session occurred, like I mentioned, in 1962. And it took place between October 11th and December 8th, and it was presided over by Pope John the 23rd. He's the one who called the session together. And during this session, the bishops discussed things like the structure and the purpose of the council, the rise of key theological voices in the church, the rejection of many of the ideas that were drafted by the Curia before the council began, and then, of course, debates on the liturgy itself. When I mention the Curia, right, before the council happened, before it took place, in Rome, they had a group of individuals that come together to form this Curia, where they begin starting to make a lot of the documents, and they draft a lot of these constitutions and decrees before things even get started. Then when the bishops go to Rome, they can actually start looking over the stuff that the Curia had already created. So this first session, they actually rejected a lot of the things that they drafted before the council began. So they had a starting point, if you will, and then they kind of worked from that. The first session is where the debate actually began on the first major document of the council. This is one that we're going to be referencing a lot in this episode. That is Sacrosanctum Concilium, and that means on the sacred liturgy. And this document wasn't completed in the first session, but they did a lot of work on it. And the session concluded in December of 62 for the winter, which the bishops needed to return to their diocese. And then sadly, the death of Pope John the 23rd in June of 1963 was kind of a delay with the second session's opening. They wanted to open the second session, but Pope John actually had, I believe, stomach cancer, and he was not in the best of health, so they had to delay it. And then with his passing, they delayed it a little bit longer. After the election of Pope St. Paul VI in June of 63, there was a renewed call to reconvene the council and to continue what they had started. So between September 29th and December 4th of 63, that is when the second session of the council took place. And this time, it was presided over by Pope Paul VI. And from the start, he encouraged a more efficient process and a clearer focus on the theological issues. I think there was this idea that there was still like a lot to get done. I didn't read this anywhere, but I'm kind of like reading into this and thinking that Pope Paul was almost like, whoa, there's a lot to do here. We really got to get going, because it seemed like he really wanted to rally everyone together to focus on the issues and really push the council forward. My understanding is he was very pro Vatican II in the sense that he wanted to take part of it and he wanted to continue what was started. I think he just kind of came into it with this fervor, if you will, of like, let's do this thing, like, let's get going, let's get it done. So during this second session, they discussed things like the nature of the church, which actually formed the basis for another major document that was created by the council titled Lumen Gentium, or On the Church. And they discussed things like the role of the bishop. And then they also made a lot of progress on continuing the discussions that took place in the first session regarding things like the liturgy. So Sacrosanctum Concilium, which we discussed earlier, was completed in this second session. It was promulgated, so that was meaning it's put into effect by official proclamation. So that means the Pope is saying, officially proclaiming that this is, effectual on December 4th, 1963. And so this document, again, arguably the most important from this whole council, it focused on liturgical renewal. It called for a more active participation of the laity. It talked about the use of vernacular language in parts of the Mass, which is a big one. We're going to talk about that. And it also talked about things like placing an emphasis on Scripture in the liturgy. But that wasn't all that they did in this second session. Believe it or not, they did even more than that. They also promulgated another document titled Inter Mirifica, or the Decree on the Means of Social Communication. And so this was created to address and discuss the church's relationship with the media. So they wanted to talk a little bit more about how they were to work together with the media, how that was to, pan out as the future went forward, kind of update things on how the Vatican was to interact with the media and what relationship they had there. And this second session there was more involved than that, but those are kind of the main things. And then it came to a close, and it was December again. So a year later, December of 63. And the reason it came to a close is because they had planned for it to. This was when they wanted it to come to a close. They had an agreement that the bishops should return home for the wintertime, and also to prepare for the next session, the next topics. And they wanted to kind of study up and revise some of the things that they were working on. The third session began on September 14th, 1964, so another year later, and it went until November 21st. So this session was presided over by Pope Paul VI, and the main discussion revolved around the finalization of Lumen Gentium, which had started in the last session. And this document's key focus was on the nature and the mission of the church, right? And so one of the things that it did is it affirmed the people of God model of the church, and it also taught on collegiality, meaning the bishop sharing responsibility with the Pope. And it also did things like clarify Mary's role, honoring her as mother of the church, but within a Christological context. So these were all things that were discussed in this one document, along with a lot of other ones, right? And so, quick side note, actually, before I continue, I just mentioned that Lumen Gentium affirmed the people of God model of the church, but I have it written here in my notes. What does that mean, right? So I took a second to try to really look into that, because this isn't something, the people of God model, that I had really heard of a lot. And what it is it emphasizes the community of all baptized believers, uniting them by, let's see, how would I best put it? Maybe a sense of shared dignity that comes through their baptism. And then it emphasizes the church as a communion rather than just a hierarchy, right? And the point of this model is they view the church as a single inclusive community. So I saw it was being referred to as a new Israel. And they had a shared head, which is Jesus Christ, and a shared law, which they were stating was the commandment to love. And then, of course, a shared purpose. So they wanted to focus on this perspective because it highlights the collective mission and the importance of every person's contribution to the church, regardless of their role. So I think there was this idea that the hierarchy kind of contributed a lot, which they do, don't get me wrong. So people like the popes, the bishops, the priests, the deacons, etc. and that the higher up you were, the more you contributed, etc. And in many ways, that might be the case. But I think the point of this people of God model of the church was just to kind of reinforce that everyone's contribution to the church was important. And it didn't matter if you were the highest person or the lowest person. We were all in it together, basically. Okay, so what else came from this third session? Well, quite a few things, actually. So first, we had Unitatis Redintegratio, or the Decree on Ecumenism. And this document recognized that other Christian communities possessed elements of truth and elements of sanctification. It was basically stating that the church recognized that there was elements of truth outside of the visible Catholic boundaries, which would in turn foster dialogue with other Christians and other religions in general, while still maintaining that the fullness of the church subsists within the Catholic Church itself. This is one that we're going to talk about more here in a little while. Additionally, they produced what they called the Decree on the Eastern Catholic Churches, which affirmed their dignity in the first place, that they, deserved to be there, that they could be there. It affirmed their traditions, and on top of that, maybe most importantly, it affirmed their autonomy. So all of these documents were promulgated before the end of the third session, and then once that occurred and the session was ended, everything was closed up. So the bishops went back to their diocese, and again, they prepared for the final phase of the council on its remaining topics. They knew that there was only one more session, the fourth and final session. So they went home late November, early December to kind of prepare for that. And then this final session occurred in 1965, so the last year of the council, and it occurred between September 14th and December 8th. And once again, it was presided over by Pope St. Paul VI. And so this session, it seemed to me like when I was researching this, that it was almost one of like wrapping things up. They wanted to kind of summarize a lot of the work that was already done in the past session. And this session is where they kind of held multiple final debates on topics which ended in the approval of the 11 remaining documents that came out of the Second Vatican Council. So the majority of the documents came, or at least were finalized, from this fourth and final session. Several major documents were promulgated, including the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. And so this addressed human dignity, culture, politics, peace, the role of the church in the world, basically. And they also had the Dogmatic Constitution on Divine Revelation, which clarified, so this was supposed to clarify the relationship between Scripture and tradition, as well as, and most importantly, promote a wider access to the Bible. There was this idea that, they needed to do this, that they needed to make sure that the Bible was being promoted as much as it possibly could be, because sacred Scripture formed the basis of all the teachings of the church. Then there was a declaration on the relation of the church with non-Christian religions. This document condemned anti-Semitism, and it also affirmed respect for the truths of other religions. So additionally, they wanted to make sure that they were kind of opening this dialogue with other religions and saying, like, there are truths being said in other religions, and we want to affirm that we respect those truths as long as they are truths. So again, we're going to talk about this more here in just a little bit. Additionally, they promulgated a document called the Declaration on Religious Freedom. And what this one did was it upheld human dignity and the right to religious liberty within the truth of Christ, right? So these were kind of the most major documents, but there was a bunch of more minor documents as well. They had one Ad Gentes, which is on missionary activity. They had one on the life and the ministry of priests, one on the apostolate of the laity, one on religious life. There was a whole bunch, like a whole list here that I have. And there were other documents as well, but the ones that we kind of listed here form the majority of the documents. And so these are kind of the most popular, maybe I should say the most well-read of the documents. And then that was kind of the end of it. That was the end of the fourth and final session. And the council formally concluded on December 8th, which was the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And Pope Paul VI actually gave a wonderful closing address. And in it, he emphasized a lot of different things, but he emphasized the church pastoral mission, its dialogue with humanity, culture, how it reflects and works with science. And he talked about a renewed emphasis on love and mercy, not just the law. There was, a very heavy discussion on love and a very heavy discussion on mercy and forgiveness, and how the law being important, crucial, so is love and mercy. So to review really quickly, each session basically advanced key dimensions of the church's renewal, if you will. So the first session, it set the tone. It wanted to say we have a tone of openness, we have a tone of reform, right? And so that was the first session. The second established kind of these beginning foundational reforms, especially in the liturgy. The third clarified the church's identity, and it worked to open paths for unity, especially when dealing with other Christian denominations or other religions in general. And then the last session, it worked to wrap everything up while also bringing the church into deeper engagement with the modern world. So just to clarify, none of these sessions introduced any new dogmas, but all contribute to a pastoral, re-articulation, perhaps is the way to put it, of the truths that, needed to be re-articulated in the light of these contemporary challenges that the church felt that it was facing at the time. Okay, so what was the outcome or results of this council then? I've mentioned a bunch of different documents, and although those documents were outcomes and results in themselves, what do they mean, right? Like, what was actually accomplished? Well, let's take a second to go over some of the key results of the Second Vatican Council. First one being continuity in dogma and kind of a renewal, a pastoral renewal, if you will. So no dogma was changed. The deposit of faith remained intact the way that it was. The council reaffirmed core doctrines, right? Like the real presence in the Eucharist, papal primacy, the authority of tradition, among a bunch of other things. So the idea here being that dogma didn't need to change, and it wasn't changed. It was reaffirmed and it was solidified at an even deeper level. The next key outcome would be the liturgical reform. So the Mass could now be celebrated in local languages, though Latin did remain the norm. There was a greater emphasis on scripture in the liturgy. Lay participation was encouraged in responses, in readings, and also in roles like lectors or extraordinary ministers, although this was only in very specific circumstances. Regarding the laity and vocations, the council emphasized the universal call to holiness, that all baptized Catholics are called to live out their faith actively in the world. So it emphasized a renewed call to show others the Catholic faith through your words and deeds. The point was to be a living example of Christ's teachings. And that was another key outcome here, is that they wanted to really push that to the forefront and explain it is our role as Catholics to be a living example of Christ on earth. And then the next key results were in regard to the ecumenical outlook. So the church recognized that elements of truth existed outside of the visible Catholic boundaries. And the point of this was to foster dialogue with other Christians and other religions in general, while still maintaining that the fullness of the church subsists within the Catholic Church. And lastly, and probably most well known and talked about in terms of outcomes of Vatican II, was to call to change our engagement with the modern world. So Vatican II encouraged Catholics and the church as a whole to read what they called, quote, the signs of the times, and engage in issues of things like poverty, war, injustice, human rights, etc. And so the idea was to get involved, to help in any way possible, to spread the good news of God to anyone and everyone. And it's not like this was new, right? The Catholic Church had been doing this for generations, spreading the good news, helping your neighbor, etc. It's the way in which this engagement was to occur that was the key outcome here. So, as Pope John the 23rd said when convening the council in the first place, there was a major focus on updating the church's practices and presentations to better address the modern world. Okay, so as I mentioned right from the jump in this episode, there are tons, and I mean like tons and tons of thoughts out there regarding Vatican II. Some of these thoughts are really positive. Some of them are incredibly negative. And over time, growing up as a Catholic, I would always hear a lot about this specific council. And even to this very day, I still see and hear a lot of people talking about it. But the problem that I realized is that this topic is sadly like a lot of other topics these days, where it's just become so polarized that people are basically just choosing to believe whatever they want to believe about it, whatever it is that fits their narrative at the moment. So I have a pretty decent selection of questions here to go through. These are things, again, that either I have asked myself, that I've wondered about personally, things that I've seen online, things that I have discussed with other people in person, right? Things like that. And what I'm going to do in an effort to stick with my original goal of being impartial is I'm going to read directly from the documents produced by the council and quote them directly as much as possible when answering these questions. That way, the hope is that rather than it being an opinion or something that someone said or something like that, it'll come straight from the council itself. And so I'm hoping that this will provide some clarity as to what was actually said and done during Vatican II and what the outcomes actually were, because there's a lot of confusion here. Also, a lot of these questions below, the things that we're about to discuss, were recently addressed in our episode. It was titled, "What are the abuses of the ordinary form of the Mass?" This one is one of the most recent episodes we just produced. So if you didn't catch that episode, or if you just want additional information regarding the questions we're about to go over here, please go give that a listen. All right, so the questions themselves, right? First, did Vatican II get rid of the use of Latin or the Latin language in the Mass? And the answer to that is no, it did not. Latin remains the norm in the Mass post-Vatican II. So in the ordinary form of the Mass, the one that everyone who's listening to this who's Catholic is most likely familiar with, Latin still remains the norm in that Mass. So Latin remains the norm of the Mass to this very day, right? And the local vernacular, meaning English if you're in America, Spanish if you're in Mexico, French if you're in France, etc., it was permitted, but it was not mandated. And Pope Leo was actually very recently quoted as saying, quote, "Well, you can say Mass in Latin right now. If it's the Vatican II rite, there's no problem," end quote. So here's another quote that I thought was really important. And this comes from Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is one of the biggest documents from Vatican II. And they said, quote, "Particular law remaining in force, the use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites," end quote. So they're saying straight up in the document that they created in Vatican II, right, that Latin is to be used. It's supposed to be the primary language that is being used. The bishop of the diocese is allowed to decide to what extent the local vernacular will be used. So again, like in America, the bishop gets to decide what extent English will be used during the Mass. And this is another quote coming from Sacrosanctum Concilium, right? So it says, quote, "But since the use of the mother tongue, whether in the Mass, the administration of the sacraments, or other parts of the liturgy, frequently may be of great advantage to the people, the limits of employment may be extended. This will apply in the first place to the readings and the directives, and to some of the prayers and chants, according to the regulations on this matter, to be laid down separately in subsequent chapters," end quote. So they're saying that it's not a big deal if you want to use the local vernacular, right? They do specify that it will apply to the readings and the directives and to some of the prayers and chants, which we're going to get to that here. But they do say that you can use the local vernacular. Some areas of the ordinary form of the Mass are still specifically instructed to be said in Latin. So like we just quoted, right? They said that some of the prayers and chants can be said in the local vernacular, but not all of them. And if you look at the Roman Missal today, the Roman Missal that we have that you might open and use in church like today, it says the following in the very front, quote, "Since the faithful from different countries come together ever more frequently, it is desirable that they know how to sing together at least some parts of the ordinary of the Mass in Latin, especially the profession of faith and the Lord's Prayer," end quote. So that means that Latin is not only allowed to be used in the current ordinary form of the Mass, it's highly encouraged to be used. It's even intended to be used, going as far as having the current post-Vatican II Roman Missal straight up saying that it should be used in at least parts of the Mass. So when someone says something like Vatican II made it so that you're no longer allowed to say the Mass in Latin, or we used to say the Mass in Latin, but once Vatican II happened, we don't do that anymore. They kind of got rid of it. That's actually 100% false. The truth is almost exactly the opposite of that. Okay, so hold on, wait a second. If I'm telling you here that the use of Latin was never outlawed, and that not only can it be used, but that we're actually told it should be used in the ordinary form of the Mass today, then why isn't it? Why do I go to Mass and basically never hear Latin? Well, you'll see a common theme here, but the reality is that the decision fell on the bishops. They were given the authority to make the decision on whether or not they wanted to continue the Mass in Latin or if they wanted to start using the local vernacular more frequently. And I can't speak for the rest of the world, But here in America, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, from what I have seen, has basically decided that Latin is not going to be used at all in the ordinary form of the Mass. Not that it can't be used, or that it's wrong to use it, or it's illegal or heretical or anything like that. Just that they won't be using it, and that the priests in their diocese won't be using it. And in this case, too, I don't think it's that the priests are no longer taught Latin. I've heard that before, too. Like, the priests would say more of the Mass in Latin if they knew how to speak Latin, but they don't because Latin's not taught anymore. But my understanding is that that's not the case, and that the very large majority of seminaries still teach Latin to a high level, and that the very large majority of priests still know how to speak Latin, or at least can speak enough to say the Mass in Latin. So, yeah, to wrap this up, the bishops made the decision to use the local vernacular, and the Second Vatican Council actually called for the use of Latin in the Mass, not the other way around. All right, second question. Did Vatican II make it so that priests no longer face the altar and instead must face the people during Mass? No, Vatican II did not require the priests to face the people, which is known as versus populum. So, in fact, actually, the council documents contain no mention of the direction of the priest or what direction he should face or anything when celebrating the Mass. Nothing. They don't mention that. The traditional position, right, where the priest faces the altar in the same direction that people do, known as ad orientem, that actually still remains valid to this day. In the ordinary form of the Mass, that still remains valid. The widespread shift to that versus populum, right, or the priest facing the people, developed after Vatican II. And it developed largely through interpretations and reforms initiated in the wake of the council that came from the council, not the council itself. Okay, so again, I'm telling you that Vatican II did not say that priests have to face the people. And yet, at least here in America, the priest is always facing the people during the ordinary form of the Mass. So what gives? How is it possible that I'm telling you that that's not the case, and yet that's what's always happening? Well, the Concilium, which was a post-conciliar commission that was created to assist with implementing Sacrosanctum Concilium, it was just basically a group of people that were literally created to help implement that massive document. They created their own document titled Inter Oecumenici, or the Instruction on Implementing Liturgical Norms. And this document is actually what first introduced the idea of freestanding altars. And so this is the altars where the priest could face the people. But it introduced it as a possibility, not as some sort of directive or command or something like that. The document states, quote, "The main altar should preferably be freestanding to permit walking around it and celebrating facing the people," end quote. So this is the first post-conciliar reference to the option of the priest facing the people. So it encouraged it, but it did not mandate it. Then, years later, the general instruction of the Roman Missal stated the following, quote, "The altar should be built separate from the wall in such a way that it's possible to walk around it easily, and that Mass can be celebrated facing the people, which is desirable wherever possible," end quote. So what we have here is we went from Vatican II not mentioning it. Again, they did not mention it at all, not during the council, not during their documents, etc. To after Vatican II, the Concilium, the group created to assist with helping to implement the things that happened during the council, right? This group stating that it was an option, right, but not mandating it. To the Roman Missal today, now saying that it's desirable and encouraged wherever possible. So what happened? That's actually pretty hard to figure out. I did as much digging as I possibly could, and basically what I found out was that before Vatican II, 20th century liturgical reformers were already advocating for what they called a more communal or a more dialogical form of worship, right? They wanted it to look and feel like the priest and the liturgical ministers were more a part of the community as a whole, right? So this was from scholars like Father Romano Guardi and Father Joseph Youngman, and they believed that the Mass had kind of become too passive, that it was remote feeling for the people that were there, right? And their movement sometimes overemphasized community and this idea of like a horizontal dimension of worship. And so this led to the popularization of Versus Populum, or facing the people, after the council took place. So it seems like this was a very gradual thing. It kind of slowly took place over the course of many years. We're talking 5, 10, 15 years, stemming from these liturgical reformers, these individuals who wanted a more, what they called, communal form of worship. But that didn't really make a lot of sense to me, right? Like, just because reformers want change doesn't mean it should happen, right? They could say, like, we don't want there to be the Eucharist anymore. And that doesn't mean it just happens. So what did the Pope actually say about this? Well, Cardinal Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI, was actually incredibly critical of how Versus Populum was applied, specifically the fact that it was applied without any theological grounding. And he was really kind of against just the idea of the priest facing the people in general. So among other things, he states, quote, "The turning of the priest toward the people has turned the community into a self-enclosed circle. In its outward form, it no longer opens out on what lies ahead and above, but is locked into itself," end quote. So he was strongly advocating for a recentering of the liturgy on God and not on the assembly, not on the people that were there. And he supported the idea of restoring ad orientem posture, or facing the altar, where it was appropriate. Now, I want to be fair here, because I promised I would be, at least as much as I can be. He does mention that facing the people can be beneficial in some parts of the Mass. So if I remember correctly, in his book, he was talking about the readings and stuff, where he was saying that it could actually be beneficial for the priest to be facing the people during those parts. But he specifically states that the celebration of the Eucharist is not one of those parts. And that's kind of where, like, the biggest debate comes in terms of the orientation of the priest, because that's, the most important part of the Mass. So just to summarize this, Vatican II did not mandate that priests must face the people while celebrating Mass. It actually didn't mention it at all. The shift from ad orientem, or, facing the altar, to Versus Populum, or facing the people, is more of an innovation that occurred after Vatican II, and it was inspired by liturgical trends, not conciliar mandates. It, technically speaking, it has no doctrinal basis, and it remains completely optional. The Church continues to allow both orientations in the ordinary form of the Mass, and interest in restoring the ad orientem posture has actually grown in recent years, especially under Pope Benedict's guidance. There was some change with Pope Francis and some other things, and, we're not going to get into all of that, but Pope Benedict was very pro facing the altar, at least for certain parts of the Mass, and it's still allowed. So to this very day, you could go into the ordinary form of the Mass, and it would not be wrong or incorrect at all for the priest to be facing the altar, especially when consecrating the Eucharist. All right, third question. Did Vatican II update the music of the Mass, or make it so that Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony were to be replaced by more modern music? Oftentimes I hear the reason why some churches have, folk music or pop music or things like that was because of Vatican II. That before Vatican II, that wouldn't fly. And then after Vatican II, it did fly. And it was because of what they did. It was decisions that they made during the council. It was parts of their documents, etc. And the reality of this is, it's just like a kind of yes and a kind of no. Like, did they speak about the music of the Mass in the documents of Vatican II? Yes, absolutely. So it's different than the last question, where they didn't speak about the orientation of the priest at all. They did speak about the music, quite a good bit, actually. In Sacrosanctum Concilium, they actually go into a decent amount of detail regarding music of the Mass. And then additionally, after Vatican II, they created another document by the name of Musicam Sacram, or the Instruction of Music in the Liturgy. And this is the document where they talk a lot about a wide range of things, such as the importance of music in the first place, like why we have music in the liturgy, the general norms on how it should take place. They talk about things to consider when approaching the music of the liturgy, where the use of the local vernacular falls into the equation, etc. It's a big document, and it talks about a lot of really good stuff. And it was written just a couple years after Vatican II ended. But the problem arises with the confusion surrounding this. And I think that's actually where this question of changes to the music comes from. And, I'll admit, I was not around before Vatican II, but my understanding from speaking to the people who were around before Vatican II was that the music of the time was, again, before Vatican II, it was very reverent, it was very holy. And there was a lot of Latin. There was a lot more Gregorian chant. And when Latin was not being used, they were using devotional songs, which were very classical compositions. These compositions were sacred. They had a lot of depth. They had a lot of complexity to them. After Vatican II, a lot of that did change. Now we often hear songs in the Mass that are more modern, for lack of a better way to put it. So we have songs like, which I'm sure you've heard of some of these, On Eagle's Wings, or Gather Us In, or Table of Plenty, etc. So some Catholics believe that these songs are, they're not reverent. They're not appropriate for the liturgy. And other people love them, actually, believe it or not. And so the question still stands. Why did Vatican II change things to make it so that these more modern songs were the norm? And the answer is that it didn't, right? Although we mentioned earlier that Vatican II did speak in some depth about sacred music, they actually did not change things in the way that a lot of people might think they did. So, for example, I hear oftentimes about people talking about how Vatican II got rid of Gregorian chant and how it's kind of a shame, right? Like Gregorian chant's beautiful and we don't have it anymore because during Vatican II they got rid of it. But let me read you something directly from Sacrosanctum Concilium. Quote, "The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specifically suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services," end quote. So not only did Vatican II not say that the church should get rid of Gregorian chant, they actually stated that Gregorian chant has pride of place, meaning that it should be the top priority when it comes to the Mass. And that hasn't changed. To this day, they've never reversed that or changed that or anything. So in the ordinary form of the Mass, to this very day, Gregorian chant is still intended to have priority over all other types of music. And then I also hear people talk a lot about the influx of modern music into the liturgy, and most specifically the use of different instruments in the Mass, like maybe like drums or guitars or something like that, which before Vatican II were very seldom, if ever, seen. And Sacrosanctum Concilium touches on this kind of in a way. They state, quote, "Other kinds of sacred music are by no means excluded, especially polyphony," end quote. And polyphony, that word, by the way, it's basically just the practice of combining parts of a song into melodies that are then harmonized together. So essentially making the song. You're taking multiple different multiple different harmonies. You're creating them into a melody, and you're making a song out of it, basically. And so the question becomes, where did Vatican II mention guitars or drums or updating the music to be more modern and stuff like that? Well, they don't. In Musicam Sacram, which is another document that came later on after Vatican II, which we mentioned earlier, they actually say pretty much the opposite. So here's a section from that document that I think speaks perfectly to this question about instruments, about modern music, etc. in the Mass. Quote, "The pipe organ is to be held in high esteem, for it is the traditional musical instrument that adds a wonderful splendor to the Church's ceremonies and powerfully lifts up the spirit to God and to higher things. But other instruments also may be admitted for use in divine worship, with the knowledge and consent of the competent territorial authority. This may be done, however, only on condition that the instruments are suitable or can be made suitable for sacred use, are in accord with the dignity of the place of worship, and truly contribute to the uplifting of the faithful. One criterion for accepting and using musical instruments is the genus and tradition of the particular peoples. At the same time, however, instruments that are generally associated and used only with worldly music are to be absolutely barred from liturgical services and religious devotions." End quote. So, instruments generally associated with worldly music can mean different things to different people. I'm going to guess that, just for me, an electric guitar or a synthesizer or some sort of DJ board would most likely fall under that category, along with many other instruments, but they don't define that. They don't say what that is that they're talking about being barred from the liturgy. So I won't try to pretend that I know either. Another thing that I thought was pretty fascinating here when I was reading over this part about music in the Mass was that they actually put a really large emphasis on the training and formation of musicians. So they state the following, quote, "Musicians must be carefully trained and choirs must be diligently promoted," end quote. So Vatican II actually expected and encouraged ongoing education in sacred music. It called for scholarly and spiritual formation of musicians in order to serve the liturgy well. So it didn't want to just pick anybody and be like, hey, join the choir. Vatican II specifically dictates that the individuals that were chosen to take part in the music of the sacred liturgy were meant to be well versed in scripture, theology, etc., in order to ensure that they could most accurately reflect that in the music that they created. So now we basically find ourselves in the same place we were in the last questions, right? Which is that if Vatican II and the documents created by the council did not say anything about getting rid of Gregorian chant, if they did not say anything about using guitars or drums in the Mass or whatever, and if they did not say anything about replacing sacred hymns with modern songs, how did we get here? Why is it that that's the case almost everywhere you go? And, like a lot of other things we've been discussing, I think most of this comes down to the vagueness and the ambiguity that stemmed from the documents that were created after Vatican II, like Musicam Sacram, which we just talked about earlier, right? And it states that we should only use instruments that are suitable for divine worship. But what does that mean? What is suitable? Who gets to decide that, right? What's suitable for you might not be suitable for me, and vice versa. And that's just one example. This vagueness is everywhere in these documents. So they give some direction, right? But they often leave a lot of room for interpretation, which in turn allowed for a wide range of this experimentation, if you will, with music in the liturgy and a push by some people to change it. So I did more digging into this. I really wanted to know what was going on here because I was like, this is so interesting. And it really, from what I could tell, began with the 1960s Cultural Revolution, right? And they had this liturgical enthusiasm, is one way that I read it. And so in the late 1960s, there was a lot of shifts in general in the world with culture, music, authority, all that stuff, right? And so folk music, protest songs, the spirit of social change, social justice, it was influencing everyone, but it also influenced young Catholics. So liturgists began using things like guitars, tambourines, folk melodies, etc., to appeal to the youth. And hymns that were emphasizing emotion, comfort, and community were given more importance than things like solemn worship. And so this spirit coincided with the Council Vatican II's call for renewal, even though it often misrepresented what the council was actually trying to teach and say. Then we get the St. Louis Jesuits. And so in the 1970, a group of young Jesuits at St. Louis University, right? Jan Schutt, Bob Dufford, John Foley, and others began actually composing music in a folk or poppy style. So they created things like Here I Am, Lord, Be Not Afraid, Sing to the Mountains, City of God, etc. Like all these songs are a lot of the songs that you've heard of before. And these songs were really catchy. They still are. I mean, a lot of them get stuck in my head for like forever. And they were emotionally appealing. They were easy to sing, right? They didn't require a lot. And they were, things that were easy for a parish to pick up. The problem is that they were often really vague or even sometimes problematic theologically. And despite that, they were hugely popular, especially in the United States, because at the time, resources for Gregorian chant were scarce and then growing more and more scarce, right? It's not everybody that you know that can sing in Gregorian chant. It's probably no one that you know, especially nowadays. And then additionally, parishes lacked trained choirs. They lacked organists. They lacked a lot of these things. Just like the Gregorian chant, it's not every day that you meet somebody just in your neighborhood or out for a walk that plays the organ. But I'm sure you know at least one person in your life that plays the guitar, right? So it was easier to get somebody in to play the guitar than it was to find somebody who was in a trained choir or who was an organist or who knew Gregorian chant, etc. And then on top of that, liturgical leadership often encouraged more, participation, maybe you would say, through this modern music. And so even though these songs were, maybe problematic theologically, this idea of this folk mass, it actually grew. And this is not because Vatican II asked for it, but it was because it filled a vacuum that was created by the ambiguity, the unclear directives, the cultural trends, and then, the desire for accessible worship. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, there was further reinforcement of this more modernized folky music through the hymnals and their publishers. So the publishers like Oregon Catholic Press and GIA Publications, they actually began producing hymnals that were full of these modern songs that were made by Schutt, Haas, etc., right? And what they did it for settings for piano and guitar. So when they produced these songs, instead of having it be produced specifically for the organ, they started doing it for settings for the piano, settings for the guitar, etc. And these hymnals were really focused on lyrics like peace and justice and inclusivity. And that was sometimes at the expense of doctrine or reverence, etc. And these hymnals, they quickly began to become the standard fare in the US parishes. If you were to go today and look in your church, that's what you're going to find for sure. And that reinforced this shift even more. The irony of this, which I found while doing my research, was that at the same time, the official music of the church, right, Gregorian chant, the propers, etc., they were actually neglected, even though Vatican II never said to abandon them. It was almost just like a personal choice that these publishers made, where this new modern folky type of music was gaining a lot of popularity and a lot of steam. And so these publishers kind of just got behind it. Whereas since it was really hard to find people that could sing Gregorian chant, to find organists, etc., they almost kind of just let that go. And just to say, again, like that doesn't really vibe with what Vatican II was saying. It's just what happened. So that leads us to where we are today. Let's just wrap this up here. The documents produced by Vatican II never mentioned the removal of Gregorian chant. They never mentioned the need for new instruments. They never mentioned the desire to modernize the music of the liturgy, etc. What it did mention, the documents from Vatican II, that is, was that Gregorian chant actually has pride of place, that the pipe organ is the number one instrument that should be used in all churches, and that those who are participating in the music of the Mass should be carefully trained. And not only that, but they should be knowledgeable about the faith, right? They should know what they're talking about so that they can serve their role reverently. However, sadly, by not being specific enough in the documents that they produced, Vatican II left the door open for a lot of interpretations that some individuals chose to take and run with. And these musical interpretations were catchy and simple to use, so they caught on really quickly, and they've been used ever since. Okay, fourth question. Did Vatican II make it so that taking communion in the hand was required and that you were supposed to stand while receiving the Eucharist instead of kneeling? I'm sure by now you're seeing a trend here. The answer to this question is no. This is another one that we spoke about in length in our episode on abuses of the ordinary form of the Mass. So I'm going to keep this a little bit shorter. And if you want like a fully fleshed out answer, I would go to that episode and give it a listen. But the gist here is that the Second Vatican Council actually never addressed communion posture or the method of taking communion. So this was just another example of something that they did not actually address. Addressing this came later. The definitive modern document on the subject is called Memoriale Domini, which was written by Pope Paul VI. And in it, he speaks at length about the action of receiving communion in the hand. And he even talks and surveys the bishops to better understand their thoughts on the issue. And the conclusion that he comes to, the conclusion that's still the most updated ruling and direction that we have on this topic, is that the Eucharist should be taken on the tongue rather than in the hand whenever possible. That taking the Eucharist in the hand is technically permissible, but that it is not the norm and it should only be done in special circumstances. So then why do I always see everyone taking communion in the hand? Why was I taught in religious education to take the communion in the hand? Again, this document that they created, it left room for interpretation. More specifically, Pope Paul stated that it was up to the local bishops to decide if they wanted to request an indult from Rome to allow their congregations to receive communion in the hand. So yeah, you heard that correctly. Taking communion in the hand was seen as being something that you had to get special permission to do, an indult from Rome. In the 1970s, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, they did exactly that. They requested an indult for those in the United States to receive communion in the hand, which was accepted. And that indult is still in place to this day. it can be taken away at any moment. I was reading that too, that Pope Leo any day could just say no more and the indult could be abolished, but it hasn't been and probably never will be. The practice gained more and more popularity over the years. So in the beginning, when Vatican II first happened, it probably wasn't the most popular thing of all time because everybody was used to just taking the Eucharist on the tongue. As time went on, it just got more and more and more popular until today when it's seen everywhere. And then you have things like flu season or COVID or whatever, and it made it so that many people just thought that it was much safer and more responsible to take it in the hand rather than taking it on their tongue. So again, the increase in popularity of the practice of taking communion in the hand was not a result of Vatican II. It was actually not mentioned at all. It stems from local bishops choosing, for whatever reasons they may have, to request special permission for those in their diocese to receive communion in the hand. The last definitive document that we have regarding this topic specifically states that everyone should receive communion on the tongue, and that the hand should only be used whenever absolutely necessary. All right. Let's see. Let's do one more. Let me pick. Okay. Did Vatican II state that all religions are equal and that other religions could lead to salvation? I heard this one, which this is one that I actually haven't heard in my personal life, but I was reading about other people talking about it online. And it seemed to be that there's this idea that post-Vatican II, the church now teaches that all religions are equally valid in terms of being a path to God. That is not the case. Vatican II did recognize truths found in other religions, but it specifically stated that in many of the documents they created, that only Christ is the way to salvation. And I think the confusion comes from the fact that the council wanted to promote dialogue with other religions. So they wanted to show that the Catholic faith was open and welcoming, and that as Catholics, we're capable of showing mutual respect to people who are a part of other religions. The problem, though, was that they, by doing this, I think a lot of people took it a little bit further. And the reality was that they distinctly upheld the unique role of the Catholic Church in salvation and stated, this is what they state. So in Lumen Gentium, they said, quote, "This sacred council professes that the church is necessary for salvation," end quote. And then in another minor document, Nostra Aetate, they said, quote, "The Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions," end quote. So that means that, let's just say there was a religion out there that said that Mary was the mother of Jesus, but then said all sorts of crazy things that were completely against the Catholic faith. Vatican II is saying that they would agree with the true and holy teaching of that religion that states that Mary is the mother of Jesus, but then they would reject everything else. It's not like they would say, oh yeah, everything else is good too. So the idea that post-Vatican II thought states that all religions are equally valid paths to God is not actually the case. It's not what they said. What the council wanted was to foster respect and dialogue between the different religions, whether that's other Christian denominations or other religions as a whole. And they were willing to confirm that some religions did teach things that were true and holy, but that the church itself is necessary for salvation in that it possesses the full truth and not just bits and pieces of it. They were open to the fact that other religions might have pieces of truth within them. And they weren't willing to say, like, no, just because we disagree with most of the stuff, we're going to disagree with everything. What they were trying to say is there's aspects of these religions that are true, that are sacred, right? But there are a lot of aspects that aren't, and that the Catholic Church itself is what is necessary for salvation, considering the Catholic Church is the one that possesses the full truth. So, yeah, hopefully that wraps that up a little bit. All right, I'm going to stop right there. That has got to be, this is the longest episode I think I've ever produced, and we're still going on here. And it's funny because I have to stop myself because there's more. Like, I have more questions here that I wanted to go into. I could talk a lot more regarding all of this. There's just so much to cover. This one's also really important, this episode, to me personally, because although I do my best to stay impartial, there is just so much that is misunderstood. Or maybe the better way to put it in reality is that it's not understood at all about Vatican II that it drives me nuts. Like, I lived my entire life thinking that a lot of the questions that we just went through were all true. I would even go as far as saying that I was taught that a lot of those things were true. People told me that that was the case. But something inside me, especially recently, has always been thinking, why? Like, why would they do that? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. I'm always just like, why would they do that? Like, people are telling me that Vatican II almost like destroyed Catholicism. And I'm like, I just don't get it. Like, what is going, why would they do that? Right. And so once I took the time to actually look into everything, to actually read the documents themselves and not just read commentaries on them or people's ideas about the documents, right? No, to actually read the documents, I was able to start getting answers to the questions that I was asking, right? Why did this take place and everything? And a lot of it was that it didn't take place. And so I would say straight up right now that anyone listening to this should do the exact same thing. Don't take my word for it. Seriously, don't. Just don't do that. Go take a few minutes, give yourself 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever. Do a couple minutes a day, whatever you got to do to actually read these documents yourself. Every single one of the documents from this council, at least that I could see, is readily available online for free in a PDF format. If you go to Google, you just type in Vatican II documents or pick a specific document, right? Let's say you want to read Sacrosanctum Concilium. Just go in to Google, type that in, or any of the other ones, and you should be able to find a free PDF online that's within the first couple results, and it has all the text inside of it. Read it, study it, see it for yourself. Don't rely on somebody else, right? If I said something in this episode that you completely disagree with, or you say that is not true, this guy's not saying the truth, he's lying right now, right? Please, I'm begging you, go read the documents, go study them, read it for yourself, right? And if you have questions, you can always send your questions to me, but you can also ask your parish priest. Ask them why most people take communion in the hand. Ask your priest why there's no more Gregorian chant. Ask them why the Our Father is no longer said in Latin, even when the Roman Missal that they have in their church specifically says that it should be. I would just recommend, my recommendation to you is that before you do that, before you go to your priest or your deacon or whoever and have that conversation, please really read up on what the Vatican has said about these items. Go into the conversations with your priest or your deacon or whoever prepared. Make sure you have a solid footing, because I have found that sometimes even ordained clergy, they say things that might not really match up with what the magisterium or the catechism or canon law, etc. says. And that's not a dig to them. That's everyone is capable of making mistakes. I make a ton of mistakes every day. I've probably made a ton of mistakes in this episode right here. But it's best when it comes to things like this, things that are very serious, things that impact our faith a lot, to take the time to do your own research. You don't want to let other people tell you what's going on, right? Because other people have their own agendas. You want to find out for yourself. And I can't even begin to explain to you how much having that mindset has helped me over the past few years as I have been on this journey of growing in my faith. All right. I will stop there. That wraps us up. Thank you for joining me. This was a big one. I hope that those of you that made it all the way to the end, first, God bless you for making it, because wow, that was a lot. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it entertaining. I love learning about this stuff. I love writing about this stuff. I love speaking about this stuff. But I can understand that for some people, it's like, whoa, boring. So hopefully for you, especially those that made it to the end, you enjoyed it. And like I mentioned, there's just so much more to discuss here. It's such a huge topic. Odds are I'm going to circle back to this in the future, but we're going to have to just wait and see. Please remember before you go that every day when I record these episodes, anytime I record one, and then any other days that I'm not recording an episode, I'm just praying in general, I'm thinking about and praying for everyone that listens to this show. So whatever you're going through in life, wherever you're living, whatever you're dealing with, please know that you have someone out there, me, thinking and praying for you. So never give up hope. Never let the darkness win. There is light out there, and I promise you, if you continue to search for that light, you will find it. I'm your host, Michael Ryan, and as always, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May his face shine upon you and be gracious to you, and may he look upon you kindly and give you peace. I hope all of you have an absolutely wonderful day, and I will see you in the next episode.